We are 4 months away from the next federal election, which will, of course, as most federal elections are, be very interesting. Campaign Research has conducted a national public opinion poll of over 2,700 people on their views of the upcoming federal election. The Conservative Party still holding a small lead over the Liberals, 3%, 35% for the Conservatives, 32% for the Liberals. This gap, not surprising, I think we all know this, has narrowed since the start of the year. And amongst the other interesting findings that are in this is how close the Green Party and the New Democratic Party are, with the Green Party put at about 12% support, the NDP at 14%. Eli Yufest is the Chief Executive Officer of Campaign Research. Good afternoon, Eli.
Hi, how are you?
I'm not so bad. Did this number come as somewhat of a surprise of you?
Yeah, if you're referring to the NDP, a number that you just spoke about a little bit, yeah. The NDP being where they are, and conversely the Green Party performing as well as they are, that to me was one of the biggest shocks of this poll. To your point, the NDP and the Green are now sort of neck and neck, as it were. And many people now see the Green as an alternative or substitute, certainly to the NDP, but even compared to the other parties. And so if I were the other parties, I'd be really watching that one quite closely.
So that's what you talk in your report here about a voter gap analysis, which talks about whether or not people would be willing to consider other, in air quotes, political parties. How does that all work? How does that come together?
Yeah, so we do a periodic analysis called the voter gap analysis, and basically what it measures is voters, how strong voter intent is towards a particular party. And so we ask a number of questions and do a number of types of analytics to derive the number that we put out a couple of days ago. And so in short, and I'll just use the NDP and the Green Party as an example. Right now, we see virtually an identical number of people that are considering or will vote for both the NDP and the Green, and they're basically at the same levels. And so, conversely, when we see where their ceiling is or what their opportunity is to garner the most number of votes, again, the NDP and the Green are effectively tied. And so, of concern to the NDP and Jagmeet Singh is they might be replaced, according to our analysis, I shouldn't say replaced, but I should say probably more aptly overtaken by the Green Party because of just how many people are actually considering to vote for the Green Party over the NDP.
So I don't know the methodology involved, so maybe we can find out a little bit about that here. When you're asking these 2,700 people, are they coming from across the country?
Yeah, so this is a representative sample from across Canada, so 2,700 people across Canada, broken down by a representative sample of age and gender and proportion of the province that they live in. And so that's all reflective of 2016 census data from Statistics Canada. And so we then take those numbers and we ask, a couple of questions. For example, which party are you most likely to vote for? And so I'll use the example of the Conservatives in this case. 25% of the population have every intent to vote for the Conservatives in the upcoming federal election, and that vote is the core Conservative votes, rock solid, very, very unlikely to change. Similarly, when we ask that among other people, only 17% of people say that they will, come hell or high water, vote for the Liberals. And so the core Liberal vote, as it were, was only 17% versus the core Conservative vote at 25%. And then we ask a series of questions about, well, if you're going to vote for, let's say, the Conservatives, would you consider another party? And so then we determine how strong that vote is, that core foundation vote. And so based on our analysis, we're able to determine how many people might actually end up switching from a Conservative or Conservative intender to another party. And so we do that across all party lines. And what we see here is Conservatives have the strongest core support at 25%. Liberals are at 17% core support. And then we see the NDP and Green tied at 7%.
So, have you seen this kind of strength in a fourth party before? It goes back a long time before I can really see it. It would have been Bloc Québécois, but that, of course, was regional.
Yeah. So what's interesting here is we typically see the Liberal Party as being the most, or we see voters most open to voting for the Liberal Party. Typically, I would say anytime we conduct this analysis at a national level or across the provinces, the Liberal Party is sort of the default vote among most voters. And so what's interesting in this analysis is that that isn't actually happening right now federally. We see a lot of voters are open to the Conservatives, and they're even considering, the Green Party. And so, of particular concern to the Liberals is exactly that. That typically voters are most open to voting for the Liberals, but in this case, we haven't seen it federally, and it's probably because of some of the issues that the federal government and the federal Liberal Party and Justin Trudeau have encountered since the start of this year.
Or maybe it's just because we're changing and we're not inclined, to vote the way our dad did.
It could be. Yeah, I actually. It's funny you say that. I was on the subway this morning coming into my office, and I saw a funny ad on the subway that said, "Just because your parents did banking this way doesn't mean you have to." And so maybe you're onto something. Maybe there's a generational change or demographic change that's happening in Canada where people are less inclined to vote Liberal because they were sort of the default party of our parents' generation. And now, alternatives, namely the Greens, are being considered more frequently.
Your questions also ask about who would make the best prime minister, and it's clear from the numbers that really people aren't all that impressed with any of them.
Yeah, exactly. That's it's sort of when we have analyzed this over the last year and a half. The typical response would have been Trudeau. So Trudeau was sort of the person they know, the devil they know, and so typically, a year ago, had we asked this question, a plurality would have suggested that sticking with Trudeau would have been the best bet. Since the start of this year, we've seen basically Andrew Scheer and Justin Trudeau tied. And so of particular concern, if I was Trudeau, is now he's increasingly being seen by the electorate as a good alternative for best prime minister, or I should say, as an alternative to Justin Trudeau. I mean, these numbers don't speak volumes about any of the candidates, to your point, but certainly it's better news for Andrew Scheer because he's now seen as a good alternative to Prime Minister Trudeau.
There's a lot of things that can happen, obviously, over the 4 months that we have left until an election is actually held. The campaign action gets underway. People start spending millions of dollars on advertising. All that stuff happens. Is there a danger, do you think, in the volatility of these numbers, in maybe both the NDP and the Greens being squeezed down to nothing?
It's possible. You raise a good point about advertising dollars. As most of your listeners and most people in Ontario or Southern Ontario anyway were watching the Raptors game yesterday, we saw a lot of ads on both sides of the spectrum, advertising one position or another. And so they typically were either in favor or against, the Conservatives or promoting more liberal parties. And so is it possible that the NDP and Green might be squeezed out as the election sort of ramps up and advertising spending kicks in? Absolutely, because most of the money is being raised by the Conservative Party, and so they're going to be spending a lot of money promoting themselves, of course. And then we know through various disclosures that the Liberal Party is in second place in terms of money raised, year to date. And so, of course, they're going to be spending a lot of money on their campaign. And so, plus you layer in all the third parties, and you've got a potentially disastrous effect for the Greens and the NDP if they get squeezed out in all this advertising.
We've seen some advances for the Green Party in this country, and we've certainly seen it in Europe as well. What do you think? Is this the real breakthrough this party's been waiting for so long?
I think if there was ever a time, certainly in recent history, for the Green Party to make a breakthrough, it will be in this election. We've seen their success in Prince Edward Island. We've seen their success in the European Union. They've won by-elections, and so the electorate seemingly is looking for alternatives versus the status quo. And by status quo, I mean the Conservative Liberals and NDP. And so if there ever was a time in Canada where the Greens could break through, now is their time. Voters are considering them. Voters are looking at them increasingly more, and certainly their recent successes across Canada and even Europe is proof of that.
There's some interesting strategic questions there on the part of the parties that are involved, because, in a lot of previous elections, to be honest, the NDP has largely been ignored by the Conservatives and the Liberals as their campaign, but it may not be the case that they can do that anymore.
No, so I think the key thing here is if the Greens perform better than they have in the past, and the NDP continues to perform at about the same rate, it actually poses a pretty interesting prospect for the Conservatives. If the Greens are typically siphoning more progressive, more left-leaning votes, they will typically steal them from either the NDP and or the Liberal Party. And so what that creates for Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives is an opportunity to sort of sneak up the middle and perhaps win ridings where they won by a small margin last time, or win ridings where they lost by a small margin last time to the Liberals, let's say. And so if anything, the stronger the Green Party gets, to me, it creates, unless they become really, really strong and they're able to win the seats, it creates a more interesting dynamic and an opportunity for Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives.
You also noted the Prime Minister's job disapproval rating, and we have to put it that way because it is on the negative side, down to 54%, which I think tends to show the short memory that most people have.
Yeah, that number has been above 50%, basically since the start of this year. And so there is certainly a majority of people that disapprove of his performance. And so, of course, that is translated into, Liberal voter intent and best Prime Minister. I think what's actually kind of interesting is if we look at the approval numbers, so we ask of Justin Trudeau, Andrew Scheer, Jagmeet Singh, and Elizabeth May approval numbers. And so Elizabeth May has the single largest approval of any one of those leaders, and so at 35%. And so, what's interesting is people personally like Elizabeth May. They like her as a leader, I suppose. In this case, they approve of what she's doing. Now she needs to take that relatively strong equity, that relatively strong position that she has, and try to translate it towards the Green Party, because the Green Party underperforms, as it were, relative to Elizabeth May personally. And so the trick for her and the Greens is to take that good position that Elizabeth May has personally and try to direct it towards the Green Party. And if they're able to do that poses an interesting opportunity for them.
A double-edged sword, though, because a lot of times, when people say, well, I particularly like that person, they may not know a whole lot about them or their policies. And then when you find that out, things get a little bit more dicey.
Yeah, it could be. It could be. But I think, what we're seeing here in the data is that people are at least considering voting Green. And so we've certainly seen that across Canada and even the European Union. And so Canadians are looking for alternatives. The Green Party is increasingly being seen as an alternative. And so if they can develop a pragmatic plan, one that isn't too extreme, they have the potential with Elizabeth May leading them to do significant damage to the establishment three main parties.
I guess the question comes down to, is it a matter of people are looking at the Green Party and its policies and saying, well, this makes sense and I like that person, or are they just so tired of what's gone on that they're looking for something different?
It's probably a little bit of both. I think you're on the right track with both of them. I think people are sort of tired of the same old, and so they're looking for alternatives. And so Elizabeth May and the Green Party present that alternative. The other side of that is, look, everyone wants for their families and their kids clean water and clean air and clean parks. Everyone wants that. I think everyone across partisan lines could agree. And so that issue resonates to people. Among people to a point. And so if the Green Party can capitalize on that issue, and if they can build a pragmatic campaign that doesn't, for example, cost a lot, because what we've done over the last number of months is analyze carbon taxes and various green policies. And so people are generally in favor of green policies. They just don't want to pay huge fees for it. And so that's where the pragmatic approach for the Green Party has to take place. If they can come up with a pragmatic plan that addresses everyone's concern for clean water and clean air, but doesn't overburden Canadians with punitive taxes, they stand a good chance of greater electoral success than in past elections.
I'm assuming you will be doing another poll within the next few weeks?
Yeah, so we do a poll actually every single month where we track many of these metrics, and so we're in field quite often, all the time, as it were, every month, looking at not just voter intent, not just voter gap, but policy issues, personal attributes issues of the party leaders, and so we're in field all the time.
So do you think this is how was I going to put this? Do you think this is going to be a really different election than anything we've seen before?
I think so. I think what we're going to see here in this election is a couple of things. I think the sheen from Justin Trudeau from the last election has sort of worn off. Just by way of example, they achieved about 40% of the overall vote in the last election, and now they're anywhere between 30 to 32% over the last couple of months, and so that sheen has worn off. Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives are performing relatively better than where they were in the last election, and so the positioning of the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party is going to have to be different than it was last time because Prime Minister Trudeau just doesn't have the same resonance as he did last time. And then you've got this issue with the Green Party. More and more people are considering the Green Party, and so that dynamic playing out with a different positioning among the Liberals and the Conservatives performing relatively better than they did in the last election, and Jagmeet Singh and the NDP basically being almost a forgotten sort of fourth party, if I can describe them like that. Creates a very interesting dynamic across all of Canada because different interests in Quebec are going to be at play, different interests in the 905 and the 416 and the rest of Ontario are going to be at play, and even Vancouver is going to be an interesting mix where the Conservatives are increasingly stronger in that part of the country, and so there's a lot of regional dynamics at play as well as national interests and national campaigns that have to be played out.
Eli, thanks for your time today.
Thanks very much.